These historical photographs are a bridge to the past, allowing us to put ourselves in the moment just before or during a strange or horrifying event from history. They can provide insight into what the world was really like decades or even centuries ago, and bring to light something that might otherwise be confined to the history books. Number 10. On Alma's Bridge in Paris is a statue known as the Zouave. For centuries, it's been used as a yardstick to measure the height of the River Seine that flows beneath it. When the water level reached its feet, it meant the river was too high to be navigable. In 1910, the water level reached the statue's shoulders. The winter of 1909 to 1910 had been particularly wet across Europe. Heavy rainfall and snow saturated the soil in the Paris region. In December of 1909, the water level of the River Seine rose steadily, but fell before any flooding could occur. When the water level began to rise again in January of 1910, Parisians assumed the same thing would happen. Further upstream, there were reports of mudslides, but they didn't believe that there was anything to be worried about. Citizens watched as the water level reached the Zouave's feet and then kept rising. In the towns surrounding Paris, there was serious flooding. But Paris might have gotten away without too much damage, were it not for the tunnels that ran underneath the city. At the start of the 20th century, Paris had one of the most modern, up-to-date transport systems, with a system of underground trains connecting various parts of the city. There were 4 trains stationed around Paris, and more routes were being built. There were even 2 railway lines that ran along the banks of the river. These became the perfect avenues for water to spread. It also spread through the sewage system, which became blocked up and overflowed onto the streets and into people's homes. The ground was too saturated for the water to be soaked up. Despite rising over 8 meters above its typical level, the River Seine didn't burst its banks, but the streets of Paris were still underwater. Photos taken during the weeks-long flood show scenes that looked like something from Vienna rather than the French capital. Some photographs show the water level still at relatively low levels where people could still walk around. But as the flooding became more intense, it became possible for people to take canoes and boats out onto the water. The police and later the army used boats to help rescue stranded residents from the second stories of homes. Navy and Army engineers were called in to build wooden walkways so people could still get around the city. At first, horse-drawn omnibuses were used, and the Gare de Lyon was turned into a stable for the thousands of horses that were needed to keep the city moving. But as the flooding got worse, the horses were unsuitable, and many passed away. Remarkably, there were no human casualties during the flooding. Parisians were evacuated, with makeshift centers set up in schools and churches. But even when the water began to subside in March, there was still a worry that it could cause problems. The streets and the lower levels of homes were covered in thick mud, and there was a worry that diseases could spread in the aftermath of the flood. A major effort was made to clean and disinfect the streets, and this effort worked. The Great Flood created what would be today around $1.5 billion in damages, but there was no cost to human life. Number 9. The August 1st, 1969 issue of Time magazine was one that featured many important stories. It had news about the Apollo 11 mission, and the cover story was the Chappaquiddick incident. But buried in the magazine was another much smaller story that would lead to a lasting change across the US. Around noon on June 22, 1969, a spark from a train crossing a bridge over the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland fell into the water. It hit a patch of oil in the river, setting the immediate area alight. According to eyewitnesses, the fire reached a height of 5 stories, causing damage to the railway bridge and spilling smoke over the neighboring industrial areas. The Cleveland Fire Department acted fast. In a little over 20 minutes, the fire had been put out. It happened so fast that nobody had been able to take a photo of the incident. Despite how dramatic it wasn't too unusual for Cleveland. The Cuyahoga River had been heavily polluted for decades. During the Civil War, Cleveland and the surrounding areas had become industrial hubs. At first, the river didn't seem to be much use, but after canals were built, it became an important navigation route for ships transporting coal, ore, and industrial products. Those ships would often leave behind oil slicks that floated atop the water. But they weren't the only source of pollution. From Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River flows into Lake Erie, where Cleveland gets most of its drinking water. This fact didn't stop the industries and residents from dumping waste and sewage into the water. Cleveland wasn't the only city on the river that caused the environmental problems, and by 1969, it was one of the most polluted waterways in the US. If anybody working near the river fell in, it was protocol for them to immediately go to the hospital, even if they'd been easily able to swim out. There was an unknown number of diseases in the river. Due to the pollution, fires happened on a somewhat regular basis. The first recorded incident occurred in 1868. It would happen 11 more times before 1969, with the largest being in 1952. The fire caused $1.5 million in damages and destroyed 3 tugboats, 3 buildings, and ship repair yards. Like the fire that would start 17 years later, it began as an oil slick. Even though the 1969 fire wasn't nearly as large or damaging as some of the earlier fires, it would be this one that caught the attention of the nation. Mayor Carl Stokes had been trying to take action on water pollution for years, and had even recently passed an initiative to start cleaning up the river. The day after the 1969 fire, he held a press conference to emphasize the importance of tackling the issue on a larger scale than just one city. Even though this didn't get much attention, one of the places that picked up the story was Time magazine. Without a photograph from the 1969 fire, they used an image from a 1952 fire. Fire crews sprayed water onto the burning river from its banks as the flames and smoke began to engulf a boat on the water. Smoke obscured most of the background, but buildings could be seen just behind it. The image, along with the account of the river that oozes rather than flows, grabbed national attention. Mayor Stokes continued to work on the issue, taking it to Congress. Part of the reason why the campaign had been so much of a success was due to another recent oil spill, this time in Santa Barbara. Environmentalism was just beginning to take hold, and the images of the Cuyahoga River in flames inspired movements. The 1969 fire and photograph of the 1952 event helped lead to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Water Act. Today, the state of the Cuyahoga River has significantly improved, and fish caught there are even deemed safe to eat. But there is still work to be done, and it's possible the river may never be as clean as it once was. Number 8. Few photographs have as large of an impact on the world as the one taken by a German scientist in 1895. The image of the bones of a woman's hand, slightly blurry but with the wedding ring clearly visible, was the first of its kind and led to a revolution in healthcare and science. In November of 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen was experimenting with a cathode ray tube. Röntgen was a scientist at the Würzburg Physical Institute at a time when scientists were still investigating the various effects of electrical discharge and electron beams. The experiment he was working on involved shielding the cathode ray tube with black cardboard. It should have stopped the light from the tube reaching out to the rest of the lab, but he soon noticed that the photographic paper he had in the lab was being illuminated by some mysterious unknown rays. For 2 months, Röntgen experimented with various types of cathode ray tubes and photographic papers. He didn't know what exactly he was seeing. It was obvious there was some kind of ray that could pass through some solid objects, but these couldn't be seen by the naked eye. He experimented by placing various things between the source of these mysterious rays and the photographic paper. These included weights, pieces of metal, and on December 21st, 1895, his wife's hand. According to legend, Anna Bertha was so shocked by what she saw that she exclaimed, "I've seen my death." It's understandable why someone at the end of the 19th century might believe that. Clearly visible in the photograph were the bones of Anna Bertha's fingers. The shape of her knuckles were made out, even if the tips of her fingers are more blurry. A dark circle on one finger shows how the mysterious rays couldn't pass through her wedding ring. Up until this point, the only way to see someone's bones was to cut into them and physically examine them. In December, Röntgen shared his discovery with the scientific community. Within weeks, the news reports had spread around the world. A January issue of the New York Times dismissed the discovery, but the following month they reported that it was true. The photograph of Anna Bertha's hand was displayed alongside the news, having convinced people that this new discovery was real. Röntgen didn't know what the mysterious rays were and simply referred to them as X-rays. At one point, it was suggested that they were called Röntgen rays, and the name is still occasionally used in German-speaking countries. But the phrase X-rays stuck, even as we learned more and more about these electromagnetic waves. But before the dangerous nature of these X-rays was figured out, a new fad emerged. What had scared Anna Bertha Röntgen became desirable, and many people had their own hands X-rayed and photographed, with rings and other jewelry clearly visible. Today, we know the dangers of repeated exposure to X-rays, but Röntgen's discovery has gone on to save countless lives and made medical procedures much easier. Number 7. One of the consequences of the First and Second World Wars, and later the Cold War, was the flurry of technological innovation that was born from a need to be better than the opposing forces. This was most obvious with the race for atomic weapons, but can be seen in other areas of life, from everything from solar to synthetic rubber. Another area where technology was pushed to catch up with the needs of war was in photography. Harold Edgerton was a talented scientist working at MIT, with an interest in photography. For him, it wasn't so much about art as it was about capturing moments that were so quick they couldn't be seen by the human eye. His more famous works today include a drop of milk forming a crown shape as it hits a surface. But capturing those small moments allowed him and other scientists to more closely understand the physics happening during the microseconds when forces change. He pioneered technology like the stroboscope, which makes rotating objects look as if they're frozen. At the start of World War II, his work caught the attention of the military, who believed that flash photography would allow them to better monitor the United States coast during the night. It was at this time that the German U-boats would surface to recharge their batteries. An electronic flash and camera could photograph the ocean at night and would uncover the U-boats and protect the coast. This was Edgerton's introduction to military work, but it wouldn't be the end. This technique was then used to gather reconnaissance images across Europe and assured the Allied forces that the plans for the D-Day invasion hadn't been discovered. Some of Edgerton's most fascinating photographs were taken after the end of the war, though. During the development and testing of America's nuclear weapons program, hundreds of thousands of photographs were taken. Special cameras were designed to better capture different elements of the test, including cameras to scan different types of waves, and those that could allow scientists to work out yield. Most of the visual images of the tests featured the growing mushroom clouds that atomic weapons would become famous for. While these were incredibly useful in their own way, there was another element of the test that scientists were eager to understand. In the fraction of a second after detonation, a light 100 times brighter than the sun is given off. Not only is this incredibly blinding, but it also happens extremely quickly. Edgerton and his partners needed to come up with a way to capture that tiny fraction of a second from a distance far enough away that the camera wouldn't be completely destroyed. The result of this challenge was the rapid action electronic shutter, or the Rapitronic. This used magnetic fields to close the camera shutter faster than a mechanical mechanism would be able to. It meant the exposure could be limited to just 2 microseconds. The images that were captured were both eerie and fascinating. Enormous white shapes, mostly spherical but irregular, with strange limb-like appendages coming out of them. It would later be discovered that this was the energy from the blast traveling along the wires from the tower. The stunning photographs allowed scientists to better understand what was happening in the microseconds after a detonation occurred. But knowing the power that these images captured can be quite scary. If someone had been looking at that blast, this may well have been the very last thing they ever saw, though it would have happened too fast for them to even register. Number 6. Ever since the ancient archaeological site was first discovered in the 18th century, the town of Pompeii has been fascinating to historians and the general public. Over the years, eerie and disturbing photos from excavations have been taken. In the early years, the archaeologist posed beside the remains of the buildings, not quite knowing what was beneath their feet. But as the years wore on and scholars were able to put a name to the destroyed location, the horrors that were buried beneath ancient volcanic flows began to be understood. It was the year 79 CE when Pompeii and neighboring towns were both destroyed and preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. For years, earthquakes had rocked the city, and Pompeii had recovered. Some buildings were even found to have been built after major earthquakes, showing that the city was getting used to this new geophysical situation. But in the second half of 79 CE, a series of earthquakes led to many citizens having already fled. Pompeii was a popular and wealthy city, with roughly 12,000 people living and working there at any one time. But by the time the volcano erupted, it's believed there were less than 2,000 people still remaining in the city. Those who hadn't escaped in time were first hit by a wave of rock and debris from the volcano. But if this had been all that occurred, many would have survived the devastation. It was a wave of superheated toxic gases and ash that took the lives of most Pompeii victims. The pyroclastic flow would have moved too quickly for anybody to escape, and reached into homes and other hiding places where people had been sheltering. It would have been a swift end for the victims, and people fell down in the exact places they'd been when the flow hit. The bodies were then surrounded and covered by ash. Over the centuries, the ash calcified and hardened around the people. When the soft organic material of the bodies deteriorated, they left behind hollow cavities, which would then be discovered centuries later. It was 1777 when one of these eerie hollows was found. The shape of the body had been imprinted on the rock, even when only a skeleton remained. In 1864, the director of excavations came up with an idea to preserve the shape even as the bodies were excavated. When hollows were discovered, plaster was poured into them. After it had hardened, the ash and debris surrounding the body could be chipped away, uncovering the form of the person who'd been buried there. Since then, over 100 casts have been made. Some of the most disturbing come from 1961, when a location called the Garden of Fugitives was uncovered. Photographs from this excavation show workers carefully uncovering the plaster casts of people frozen in their last moments. These people had managed to survive the initial shower of debris, as their remains were found on top of a layer of pumice that had already fallen. But as they tried to escape the garden where they were found, the pyroclastic flow hit. 13 victims were located in 3 separate groups, initially interpreted as 3 different families trying to make their escape. It was here where one of the most disturbing plaster casts was made, as one of the victims appears to almost push himself up to try to escape his fate. Other victims were found huddled together or lying face down on the ground. Today, the casts are kept behind glass, but can be seen on display in the ruins of Pompeii, where excavation work continues to uncover more haunting details about an apocalyptic day almost 2,000 years ago. Number 5. During the Soviet era, there were many cases of closed towns. These locations would be completely shut off to outsiders, with even relatives of the people who lived there unable to come and visit. These locations might surround important military complexes or industrial centers that were important for the Soviet government. But according to one Swedish intelligence agent, at least one of these closed towns was something completely unique. In the early days of the Cold War, there were many rumors about so-called American cities that existed in secret in the USSR. The streets were modeled after American streets, with stores that could be found in any Western city. The people who lived there wore Western clothing and spoke with American accents, but nobody there was actually American. These were spies and handlers preparing to go deep undercover in the United States. The theory was that the Soviet spies needed to be immersed in American culture before they went undercover. It's often the smallest things that can give away intelligence agents, like the fact that Americans tended to lean more than Soviets, or that different cultures could carry a bouquet of flowers differently. There were also things like parking meters that would be completely normal to Americans, but might be out of the ordinary to Soviet spies. The problem was that these spies wouldn't get the chance to visit America before they went undercover. To get around the issue, these fake towns would be built and staffed by experts and officers who knew what would make a potential spy stand out in the US. Until 1959, these were only theoretical, but Western intelligence was confident they were real. Then, a report in a Swedish journal seemed to confirm the suspicion. The journal was called Contact with the Military, with a piece written by Major Per Lindgren. Lindgren claimed the secret fake American city had been located in Vinnytsia in Ukraine. Vinnytsia is a Ukrainian city that's been around since the medieval period. After the end of the Second World War, it became home to Soviet Air Force bases and other military installations, but there is nothing to show that this city in West Ukraine had any significance. According to Lindgren, the American town that was located at Vinnytsia was surrounded by barbed wire fences. Only the top students from universities across the Soviet Union were permitted access in order to train as spies. He claimed that if any of the potential spies made a mistake in typical American customs, they would be corrected on the spot. They were taught history from American textbooks, learned about baseball, and listened to jazz and rock and roll. An American tourist might feel at home in the town, but there were some peculiarities. The streets were unusually clean. The people there were all young, and the doors to the church in the town were always locked. Lindgren provided no sources for his information, other than claiming it came from intelligence gathering. That didn't stop it being reported in American newspapers and Time magazine. A few years later, a documentary was produced that allegedly showed the city of Vinnytsia and residents going on about their typical day. The documentary was almost certainly US created and didn't show the mysterious American Vinnytsia, but the images of the extremely clean and empty but stereotypical American streets are still disturbing. Whether or not these fake towns actually existed still remains a mystery. Number 4. The final photo of the Rodney Fairy shows roughly 150 people smiling and waving as they look out at the camera. It was taken moments before disaster struck on the afternoon of February 13, 1938. The picture was captured in Sydney Harbor during the send-off for the USS Louisville. For 2 months at the start of 1938, the Louisville had been sailing around the South Pacific on a goodwill tour. Sydney was just one of many stops along the tour, and she'd only stayed there for 18 days. But during that time, the sailors had gotten to know the locals very well and were especially popular with the young women. On February 13th, the ship was set to leave Sydney and head to Melbourne. There was a large send-off, and many people purchased tickets on ferries to follow the Louisville as it left the harbor. One person hoping to take advantage of the passing trade was Charles Rosman, who owned a number of ferries and had been making good business running excursion and spectator trips. He had a new ferry, the Rodney, which was only about a month old. The ferry had 2 decks and was capable of carrying 211 between those two. By 2 p.m., he'd sold over 150 tickets at $1 each, and the passengers climbed aboard the Rodney. They were mostly young or divorced women, though there were some men and children among those, hoping to send off the visitors. Also on the water that day was a police launch carrying a band that was following the Louisville to play the sailors off. There were also many other ferries with well-wishers, as well as the typical harbor traffic. The Rodney traveled faster than the Louisville as it slowly made its way to Bradley's Head. It ran alongside the Navy ship for a while before the passengers shouted to take the ferry to the ship's port side. By this point, most of the passengers were on the upper deck. Even though the Rodney could carry 211 passengers, it was only safe for 60 to be on the top deck at any time. There were roughly 100 people on the top deck, standing on chairs and waving to sailors. Even as dangerous as it was, the people on board seemed to be oblivious to the problems. The photo of the Rodney shows the passengers smiling and waving. On the bottom deck, people hang out of the windows to get a better view. As the Rodney passed from one side of the Louisville to another, the passengers rushed to the other side to get a better view. This caused the Rodney to begin to list. Rosman was unable to do anything about the tilt, and within seconds the ferry had capsized. The police launch was nearby, and 15 of the officers there immediately dove into the water to save passengers. Some aboard the Louisville also jumped into the water to try to help people, while others lowered lifeboats and buoys to help the swimmers stay afloat. Accounts at the time described women screaming for help and passengers holding on to one another to try to stay afloat. In the confusion, people were separated from friends and family members that they'd been traveling with. Most of the passengers were rescued and brought ashore. Some were treated in the Louisville, while over 100 were taken to hospitals in Sydney. Most were only treated for shock, though some were admitted to the hospital so they could fully recover. Sadly, not everyone made it out of the incident alive. 19 passengers were unable to make it to safety. Most of those on the bottom deck went down with the ferry and they couldn't escape. Number 3. On the morning of June 25, 1848, photographer Charles Francois Thibault pointed his camera out of the window of his home in Paris and captured 2 photographs on metal plates. The photos showed an empty street with 2 barricades blocking traffic. This was the tail end of a brief revolt that cost thousands of lives. His photographs were the first ever taken of a barricade. France had been in a period of economic depression when the June Days Uprising took place. In February of that year, King Philippe was overthrown and replaced by the Second French Republic. This wouldn't be a glorious revolution, though, and the new government had to deal with high unemployment rates and a population that was looking for significant changes. Many peasants had come to Paris and similar cities looking for work. Paris also had a large population of refugees from other countries, who'd fled their homelands after anti-monarchy revolutions were quashed there. To try to combat unemployment, national workshops were set up. It provided menial tasks for the unemployed and provided money. It was a system that nobody liked. It was paid for by a tax on landowners, which made the landowners and those who still worked the land unhappy. But it also didn't provide enough money or satisfaction for the people it was supposed to be assisting. The people seeking employment were skilled artisans, and the labor didn't match their skills. When the landowners stopped paying for the workshops, the system broke down. A conservative government was elected, and on June 23rd, an announcement was made that the workshops would be closing in 3 days. Citizens were advised to join the army for work or move out of Paris. This was the spark of the uprising. The evening after the announcement was made, barricades were constructed across Paris. Omnibuses and other vehicles were overturned and surrounded by rocks and whatever material could be found from houses. There were reports of some citizens being forced to hand over materials, while other reports claimed that the citizens were merely joining the cause. Most of the revolutionaries were working-class people. It was a movement that caught the attention of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who supported the revolution in their newspaper. In response to the uprising, the government called upon the French colonial governor-general of Algeria. With the whole French army at his disposal, it wasn't long before the uprising was put down. By the time Charles Francois was taking photographs from his home, most of the fighting had already been stopped. It was only the forces in the east of Paris that were still holding out against the French army. But the photos were still extraordinary, and copies appeared in newspapers. Just visible in one of the barriers is a flag. According to researchers, it read Democratic and Social Republic. The photos were taken very early in the morning. With no one in the streets, it seems eerily still, as if something is poised and waiting to happen. The following day, the June Days Uprising was over. The troops gave a final assault on the streets of Paris. Charles Francois took another photo. This one is much less clear, possibly due to the movement of people causing the street to blur slightly. The barricades can be seen, in the process of being removed as the uprising was stopped. Number 2. After the Franklin expeditions and the searches for the missing men, the British government's interest in exploring the far north of the planet faded away. But by 1875, there was enough pressure for a newly publicly funded expedition to try to reach the North Pole. Named the British Arctic Expedition, the explorers reached the furthest north that had ever been achieved up until that point, but the mission almost ended in disaster. Along the way, photographs were taken of the ships and the Inuit communities in Greenland, and what would become Canada's Northwest Territories. The expedition was led by George Nares, a Royal Navy officer who'd already had experience exploring the Arctic. In the decades since the last British expedition, there had been many American explorations of the far north which utilized techniques learned from the local population there. The British expedition would not take on these techniques. Anybody who had seen the launching of the Erebus and Terror during the Franklin expedition might have seen a similar sight when 2 ships left Portsmouth in May of 1875, carrying with them 120 officers and men. Many of the sailors aboard had taken part in the searches for Franklin's crew. They knew the dangers that could face them in the polar region, but all were optimistic about the voyage. Unlike the Franklin expedition, the purpose of the British Arctic expedition wasn't to find the Northwest Passage. The main goal was to reach the North Pole, but they were also to conduct scientific research and map out the coast of Greenland. Some of the scientific research they were set to do included in the field of photography. How different photography techniques would fare in the Arctic conditions was unknown. As well as the freezing temperatures, photographers would have to deal with sunlight reflecting from the snow, and the different exposure times needed to get a clear picture of both the snow and darker shapes on top of it. Assistant paymaster Thomas Mitchell and engineer George White were trained in how to use different photographic techniques, and both were given equipment to take out to the Arctic. The two ships, Discovery and Alert, reached northwest Greenland in August of 1875 and spent the winter in separate bays. Nares aboard the Discovery pushed his ship the furthest north that any vessel had ever sailed. Up until this point, there was a belief that an open polar sea surrounded the North Pole. The theory suggested that a ship would be able to sail right up to the pole. Nares had never been a big believer in the theory, and now he knew it wasn't true. The expedition was equipped with sledges and dog teams, though they believed it would be better for the men to pull the sledges. In the spring, the sledging expeditions began. Almost immediately, they had to stop and wait until conditions warmed a little, as just traveling between the two ships had caused one of the sailors to suffer frostbite and stomach cramps. But at the start of April, the main push for the North Pole began. 3 separate sledging teams set out. All 3 would have to be rescued by sailors that had been left behind. They faced numerous problems, including thick snowdrifts, but the main issue the men faced was scurvy. The teams had been supplied with lime juice, but the distilling process had removed most of the vitamin C needed to keep scurvy at bay. By the end of the summer, about a third of the sailors were sick with scurvy, and Nares knew they wouldn't survive the winter. After initially being celebrated on return, the mission was labeled as a failure. The photographs that were brought back were kept hidden, though eventually copies were sent to educational institutions. Recently, a box of glass plates from the expedition was rediscovered and shared with the public. The eerie and amazing images show the ships stuck in ice, how the sailors tried to overcome this, and life for the local Inuit people. Number 1. The front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on August 2, 1946, featured a large image of 8 men sitting inside a glider and smiling for the camera. The photo looks innocent enough, if not a little strange because all the men appear to be wearing shirts and ties rather than military uniforms. But the headline above the image tells a much more disturbing story. All the men in the photograph had lost their lives in a dramatic glider crash less than 15 minutes after the photo was taken. The event had taken place at Lambert St. Louis Airport the day before. The glider was manufactured by the Robertson Company for the war effort. It was the same type that had been seen in the skies over Sicily. It had been transporting equipment across the Atlantic. The company wanted to allow the St. Louis-based workers to see the fruits of their work, so they had arranged a demonstration. Crowds of spectators were at the airport, including many young children who would get to see a glider run for the first time. Ahead of the demonstration, it was announced that Mayor William D. Becker would be going up on one of the flights. He'd been elected into the position 2 years before a lengthy legal career. During a press conference, he was asked by a reporter whether it would be safe. Becker assured him that he believed it was fine, but said that if his time had come there wouldn't be much he could do about it. The first demonstration run took place without a problem. It was the second demonstration that was to be the one that the mayor took part in, and the one that ended in disaster. His wife was also supposed to go up in the glider, but on the day they were told that the women were not permitted in military planes. Mrs. Becker was forced to watch from the sideline as her husband and other city officials sat in the glider. As well as Mayor Becker, there was William Robertson, president of the Robertson Company, and Judge Henry Mueller. For 15 minutes, the glider flew behind the transport plane, attached by a nylon rope. The two vehicles circled the airport twice at a height of roughly 2,000 feet. At 3:55 p.m., the pilot of the glider radioed that he was going to release them from the tow plane. The tether was released, and moments later, disaster struck. The right wing of the glider folded upwards before completely tearing away from the glider. On the ground, the crowd at first thought the glider's wing could be maneuvered. It was only when the wing came away that they realized something terrible had happened. The glider turned nose down, and within seconds it had hit the ground. The wing came down slower. Photographs of the disaster, taken by photographers in the crowd, were published in the following day's newspapers. Military and rescue vehicles rushed to the scene of the wreckage, only to confirm that nobody had survived. All the men had been wearing parachutes, but the disaster had happened so quickly that none of them had time to react. An investigation began immediately. The Army was able to rule out any sign of sabotage. It was later discovered that the problem was a single part in the glider, which bolted the wing to the fuselage. The part was supposed to be no thinner than 11/32 of an inch. This one was 2/32. The incident shocked the public and led to the grounding of all gliders before a thorough inspection of each had taken place. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.